Hi guys, my name is Dray and welcome back to another episode of True Crime Tuesdays, where every Tuesday I sit down with you and we hash out a true crime story together. So stories can range from anywhere between murders to disappearances, kidnappings, cults and more. So if you're a true crime freak like myself, I would highly recommend liking and subscribing, and if not, that's totally fine. I am just happy that you're here with me today, because today's story, super interesting, a little bit unhinged, but it is an Australian case. I take that back. I don't represent the Fruit Loops or support the Fruit Loops that are in this country, but this case is super interesting. So without further ado, let's just jump straight in today's story. So today's video is going to be slightly different, only because I'm not going to go into the background and the childhood of today's killer. Actually, no, today's abductor. Only to keep a little bit of mystery, because last week a couple of people had messaged me saying that they really enjoyed the plot twist at the end. So I thought this week we'll keep that same mystery going, jumping straight in. March 4, 2008. 22-year-old Julian Buchwald and 17-year-old Carolynne Watson decided to go on a nice picnic date together. Now, Julian and Carolynne had been dating for 2 years. They had actually met at church and were known to be very wholesome, very cute, and also very devout to their faith. They were also very serious and would continuously talk about marriage with each other. So they were actually waiting for Carolynne to turn 18 before they got married, and they had even set up a meeting with a pastor just in preparation for the marriage. So as you can tell, even though they were young, they were really serious about each other. So they had planned to have a picnic on Julian's mother's property, which was about 1,200 acres, and it was located in Dray in Victoria, which is about 2.5 hours away from the city of Melbourne. I think it's pretty common for couples in the city to go on dates to the arcade or the museum, or what else do people do? Go out for dinner, movies, things like that. But in a small country town where there isn't much to do, it was really common for people to go on outdoorsy types of dates, and this is exactly what Julian and Carolynne would love to do. One spot in particular that they really enjoyed was this 10-foot waterfall located on the property, and they would frequently go there to sit down, have some chats, and just spend time with each other amongst nature. So the morning of March 4, 2008, Julian takes his family car and drives to Churchill, which is where Carolynne lives with her family, picks Carolynne up, and they start driving back towards Dray, and they enter this sort of dirt road that would lead them to the waterfall. As they're driving down together towards this waterfall on this bumpy dirt road, Julian notices that there's this very interesting roadkill on the side of the road. Now, Carolynne didn't really pay much attention to this roadkill because she was just more focused on getting to the waterfall. But Julian was so intrigued by this roadkill because he actually said it was much bigger than the roadkill that was normally found in that area. Carolynne, again, is quite dismissive of this roadkill, but Julian can't get this off his mind, so he keeps bringing it up to Carolynne. But eventually, he stops talking about the roadkill and focuses on getting to the waterfall. And true enough, the car ends up in this clearing where they parked the car and then walked a little bit to this pond and this 10-foot waterfall where they would set up their picnic. As they park, they're getting the things out of the car from the picnic, including the blanket, a picnic basket, as well as the lunch that they had prepared for the date. So they talked and sat for what seemed like hours up until it was 2:30 p.m. and they both realized that they needed to leave pretty soon to make it back in time for the curfew at 3 p.m. I also wanted to mention that Julian and Carolynne had very strict parents, and they obviously had things like a curfew set up, so they were pretty responsible and very punctual, so they didn't want to be late for the curfew. So at 2:30, they packed up all their stuff and they started heading back to the car. Once in the car, they started driving down the same road that they came to arrive at the waterfall. As they're driving, Julian can't stop thinking about the roadkill that he saw earlier that day. Julian silently peers out of the window looking out for this roadkill, but he can't seem to find it. So Julian and Carolynne keep driving, and up until the end of the dirt road that would lead them back to the safety of their homes, Julian actually decides to ask Carolynne if it was okay if he could park the car and quickly check out the roadkill that he could have missed on the way back home. Carolynne is a little bit annoyed, but she ultimately agrees, and Julian parks his car to the side of the road. He gets out of the car and he actually walks towards a bend that would lead him out of Carolynne's eyesight. Now, Carolynne actually said that it wasn't very uncommon for Julian to be distracted by odd and weird things, such as roadkill, so she didn't really think too much about it. So 5 minutes has passed, and she notices that Julian is still not back. At this point, Carolynne is understandably annoyed, only because it was almost the time of the curfew, and she didn't want to piss off her parents, she didn't want to piss off her future in-laws, and on top of that, they were so close to the house, so she was getting kind of annoyed. But when 10 minutes had passed and Julian was still not back, Carolynne became sort of worried, and she was debating whether or not she wanted to get out of the car to look for a boyfriend. As she's about to get out of the car, Carolynne looks at the rearview mirror and she sees something that sends chills down her spine. Carolynne sees a figure wearing all black in a balaclava and gloves running straight towards her. Before she can even process what's happening, the figure just legs it towards the car, opens up the car door, yanks Carolynne out of the car and chucks her to the ground. Then the figure gets on top of her and starts to hog-tie her with a piece of rope, lifts her up and chucks her in the back of the boot. The car had only moved after a couple of minutes, and they drove around for what felt like 6 hours. To be exact, it was actually 6 hours that they were driving around, and Carolynne was just sat in the back being hog-tied and wondering what was going to happen to her. Finally, the car had stopped, and Carolynne was lifted out of the boot and then chucked on the dirt floor. So she didn't recognize any of surroundings, but she was in really dense bush because all she could see was bush and trees. Carolynne then saw her kidnapper approach her with a knife and started to cut her clothes up. So Carolynne is there, essentially naked, laying on the ground, and the attacker starts to get a shovel and starts to dig this massive human-sized hole. And at this point, Carolynne starts to foresee what is actually going to happen to her. Carolynne thought that she was going to be raped, killed, and then buried in a place where no one would find her because she was surrounded by really dense bush. She didn't know what else to do, so she began praying to herself that God would protect her and somehow she would get out of the situation. In the meantime, Julian's parents at about 3:30 started to get pretty concerned because Julian and Carolynne were not back from their date yet. This was very out of character for Julian because Julian was very punctual, he was very responsible, and when he said that he was going to come back by 3 p.m., the parents expected him to be back by 3 p.m. sharp. So at 3:30, Julian's mom starts walking around the property, and she actually notices on the fence there's this bottle with a note in it. And when she walks towards this bottle and she takes the note out of the bottle, she can see there's writing on it. So this note was covered in satanic symbols, and it read something along the lines of, "The boy and the girl have been taken. If you don't call the police, they will be returned to you." Now, at this point, Julian's mom is freaking out, and despite what the note says, she actually decides to call the police, and it didn't take long for the police to arrive on the property at Budgery. When the police get there, the police take a look at the note and they can see that it was signed by ONA. Now, ONA stands for the Order of the Nine Angels, which is a satanic cult. It was pretty interesting because at that time, they were only known to be based mainly around Europe, not Australia. So I googled them and this is what it says. Adherents are encouraged to secretly infiltrate organizations such as the military or Christian churches in order to destabilize them from within. There is a total rejection of ethics, and some key texts even discuss ritual sacrifice, both symbolic and actual. But oddly enough, it's said that they actually don't kill animals or children, which is really particular because it's like killing is still bad. But I don't know. Anyway, the police saw it and they actually first thought that it was a prank. But Julian's parents brought up a good point. They said that a week earlier that they actually found a very similar note covered in satanic symbols, essentially threatening them. So they knew that they had been watched for about a week and at this point they started to grow really worried for Julian. So police launched this massive search on air and land to try and find Julian and Carolynne, but they couldn't find anything, and it just seemed like they had disappeared into thin air. So like I said earlier, the police were a little bit skeptical of ONA's involvement in the kidnapping only because they haven't made it to Australia yet. But as days went by and there were no signs of Julian and Carolynne, police began to think that the search was actually going to be a recovery of the bodies as opposed to Julian and Carolynne in flesh. Mainly because the pair had only packed the clothes on their back, they only had enough food for lunch, they had nothing to protect them from animals and the harsh terrains, as well as the weather. I'm pretty sure at that time it was scorching hot throughout the days and freezing cold at night. So the police began to worry that they actually wouldn't be able to find Julian and Carolynne alive. However, 7 days later, so a week after the disappearances, a farmer was driving down Alpine National Park and he spotted a man and a woman coming out of the forest with barely any clothes. The farmer had driven ahead to the couple and had rolled down his window and asked them if everything was okay. The couple looked to be very exhausted, they had cuts all over the body and looked really, really sunburnt. The couple introduced themselves as Julian and Carolynne and expressed that they needed immediate help. So the farmer took them in and drove straight to a hospital. So the pair were highly traumatized. They had severe sunburn, they had cuts and bruises all over the body, and they just didn't look like they were in good shape. But because doctors had determined that they were ultimately going to be fine, the police decided to take both of their individual statements and separated Julian from Carolynne and began to question them about what had happened over the last 7 days. So I'm actually going to start with Julian's side of the story. So Julian tells the police he was super intrigued by this roadkill that was laying at the side of the road, blah, blah, blah. We know what we're talking about. Julian pulls over to the side of the road. He gets out of the car where Carolynne is still at, and he walks around this bend, which means that he can no longer see Carolynne and the car. He's so driven by his curiosity that he starts to walk, and eventually he comes across that roadkill that he was so intrigued by. But this is when he gets kind of curious. At this point, he sees the roadkill, but this time it was covered by shrub and trees and branches that were sort of laying around it. So he's like, oh, when we drove past it, it wasn't like that. So something must have happened. Anyway, as he's starting to take out all the twigs and the bush that is on this roadkill to uncover what it is, he said that he was hit really, really hard at the back of his head and he passed out. He was just gone. He said that everything went black, but when he had woken up to really, really dense bush, and he knew that bush was really unfamiliar to him, meaning that he was no longer on his mum's property. And on top of that, he knew it was a really long time since he's been awake, only because when he was looking at the roadkill, it was still daylight, but when he had woken up, it was completely dark. He woke up with no clothes on his body, and he was essentially tied to this tree. Julian, who's now conscious, freaks out because he doesn't know what has happened, and he doesn't know if Carolynne is safe. But miraculously, as he's looking around at his surroundings, he notices there's this large knife sitting right next to him. So he grabs the knife and he starts to cut away at his ankles, the restraints on his waist, as well as his hands, and he starts to run towards any direction to get out of there. I mean, he was super worried that someone was going to come back to finish the job, so he starts legging it at any direction. Now, let's switch back to Carolynne. So she's forced to watch this intruder dig this massive hole where she knows that she will probably be buried in, and the intruder finally stops digging, walks towards her, picks her up, and chucks her in this hole. At this point, Carolynne is freaking out because now she thinks, oh my goodness, I'm going to be buried alive and this is going to be horrifying. But to her surprise, the attacker actually starts to walk away. Now, she didn't really know what to feel at this point because even though she was relieved that it seems like nothing was going to happen, she was super cold, she had no clothes on, and she was in very secluded bush. So even if she survived, no one would be there to find her and help her get out of there. Meanwhile, Julian is just legging it through this forest and he's yelling at the top of his lungs, "Help, help, someone help me." And Carolynne actually hears this and responds back. To Julian's surprise, he's like, "Oh my goodness, it's Carolynne." And he starts legging it, following the sound of her voice. And eventually, luckily, Julian reunites with Carolynne. Julian wastes zero time. He hops down in the hole, cuts her free, and actually helps her out of the hole, and the pair begin to run. But soon enough, Julian actually realizes that Carolynne is really struggling to run, only because she's been hogtied for 6 hours. Well, 6 hours plus, and it was actually tied so tightly that she had lost a lot of the blood circulation, so she could barely walk. But this didn't stop Julian, so Julian draped Carolynne over his shoulders and stops helping her to get away. Now, they were really worried at this point because they knew that their kidnappers or potential killers were gonna find them and finish the job. Now, Julian is telling Carolynne that he miraculously found this knife near where he was tied up to a tree, and he actually suggests, hey, maybe we should look around just in case the kidnappers had left a few items behind. And true enough, they actually find a sleeping bag. But this was no ordinary sleeping bag because it had life-saving essentials in it. It had water, it had a jar of peanut butter, it had designated coconut, it had a shovel, it had a knife, it had essentials for the pair to actually survive. Also found in the sleeping bag is a toothbrush. Luxury. Well, obviously not luxury. They're not in the best situation. But they're technically not in the worst either. The pair are thrilled that they find this, but they just cannot believe their luck. For the next 2 days, the couple are actually super paranoid because they felt like someone or something was watching them. On top of that, they were dealing with weather extremes. So throughout the day, it was boiling hot. They had little to no shade, no sunscreen, obviously, and they were burning up. On top of that, they didn't have any shoes, so they were walking on the really hot dirt. And at night, they were freezing cold. They had no clothes on and essentially had to, stay really close together to create some body heat. So thank God that they had a sleeping bag with them. But after 2 days of walking around, the couple was super disappointed that they had actually walked in a full circle because they had come back to the area where they could see the massive hole the attacker had digged. But ironically, this actually saved their lives because when they got back, they didn't see any figures, but they saw a backpack. And in the backpack, there was actually more food, more clothing, and on top of that, they had a map. They were just dumbfounded by how lucky they were. Okay, again, it's not a lucky situation that they're in, but given the circumstances, they were finding all these life-saving supplies that would ultimately help them get out of there. As lucky as they were to find this backpack, it was also a reminder that the killer or the kidnapper was nearby. So fast forward to present time and the police are like, okay, we've heard your statements. We are going out to that land that you described to try and find who was responsible for all of this. So they were essentially looking for the person responsible or the people responsible, but they didn't find anything. The only thing that they did find was the massive hole that the attacker digged to bury Carolynne in. And two other things that they found was the duct tape used on Carolynne, as well as the rope and the shovel, and they had taken it back to the lab for analysis. The results of the analysis actually revealed that all of those items belonged to Julian Buchwald. This means that Julian was either involved in the kidnapping and had supplied some of these items to the kidnapper, or the supplies were actually taken from Julian by the kidnappers. So the police are like, this is a massive side-eye moment once again, and we're gonna investigate this further. So this is where the story gets really, really juicy and unhinged. Now, Julian was claiming that he was knocked out for essentially 6 hours, which is impossible because generally when people knock out, they're gone for a little while, but 6 hours was very, very uncommon. For you to be out for 6 hours, you would be knocked out with something super heavy and you would probably have really bad head trauma, but all that there was on Julian's head was the small little scratch, so something really wasn't adding up. And on top of that, why would the kidnappers use Julian's car to take Carolynne to this really dense bush? It just doesn't make sense. And how did they end up in that bush without a car? Super weird. I don't know. So the police were like, something's really fishy here. They go back to Julian and they're like, Julian, something's not adding up here. And at first, Julian, he actually stuck by his story about being really dazed, being really confused when he woke up in this bush, blah, blah, blah. But after a little bit of pressure was applied, he had confessed. So this is what really happened on the 4th of March in 2008 when Julian and Carolynne had decided to go on a picnic date together. So when they had reached the end of the dirt road, Julian gets out of the car and he walks around the bend and he gets out of Carolynne's eyesight. And what he does is that he actually gets some sort of animal skin and then puts it on the ground and covers it with a bunch of bush. He then returned wearing a fresh pair of clothes, which is all black, a balaclava as well as gloves, and starts running towards the car to startle Carolynne. So he was acting like this crazy, deranged kidnapper that lived in the bush, and he essentially tied Carolynne up and then popped her in the back of his car. When he finally reaches the Buchan Headwaters Wilderness area, he gets Carolynne out of the car, chucks her on the ground, and then starts to dig this massive hole. Then he drives about 20 meters away and waits for a little while to pretend to tie himself up, and then starts running through the forest, calling for help, like a little liar. Think about it. It was probably so sad that Carolynne had to imagine what the last few moments of her life was going to be like. She would have been so horrified listening to the sound of that shovel digging into the ground where she knew that she was going to be buried. So Julian had also scratched the back of his head to support the story that he was hit really, really hard by a rock or a really hard object. So when the police would question him, he wouldn't look suspicious. Carolynne actually said that when he had saw Julian, he looked like Dracula because there was so much blood coming from his head. So she definitely didn't suspect that he was responsible in all of this. It rained and rained as they crossed freezing creeks, and they would be super cold at night. So as the temperatures got colder and colder, the couple actually was so blessed to have this sleeping bag, but they were still freezing and super cold. So Julian actually turns to Carolynne and says, "Hey, maybe we should have sex so that we can get our body temperatures up and then we won't die." So if you haven't put two and two together, this young man was so desperate to have sex with his girlfriend, he couldn't wait until marriage, which is what the couple were wanting to do, that he devised this entire plan so that he can have sex before marriage. I have no words. It is actually super unhinged, and I cannot believe someone planned this kidnapping to have sex. 100% Julian Buchwald is the horniest kidnapper alive. What a stupid reason to kidnap someone and traumatize them for the rest of their lives. I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me. Julian kept suggesting and essentially manipulating Carolynne into having sex with him to keep themselves warm. But Carolynne held strong to her values and beliefs and refused to give in. Julian had even suggested one night that they would get married under the eyes of God, and then that way they could have sex and it would be wrong. But like I said, my girl Carolynne, she held strong to her values and she refused. And Julian began to grow very tired and very annoyed when he realized that his plan was not working. So at this point, Julian gives up and he starts leading them back to the main road where he was found by that farmer and then driven to the hospital. While out in bail, he actually misses his court appearance in Morwell, and it turns out that he had actually fled overseas. So Julian and his family were actually German. So Julian moved to Australia when he was 1, but he had little to no ties with Germany. He didn't speak the language, and he had very little family who actually resided in Germany still. Now, Julian was not a citizen, but he was actually a permanent resident in Australia. So let's put our thinking caps on. Where do you think that a German fugitive would go to hide from Australia? It was India. Julian had chosen India. Sorry, I'm laughing because it's such a random pick. Julian is a typical German boy. Fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, but he decides to dye his hair black and essentially commit blackface because he had tanned himself to try to look Indian, and then he fled to India with a fake Indian passport. But he wasn't very successful and didn't get very far because he was soon arrested and then brought back to Australia. Once in Australia, he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months in prison for the kidnapping and 6 months for trying to flee to India and get away. Now, when Julian completes his sentence, he is desperate to become an Australian citizen and remain in Australia. However, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, also known as Old Mate ScoMo, kicks him out of the country and essentially sends him back to Germany. Julian was reported to really experience some hardships and struggled, mainly because he didn't speak the language there and he had little to no family ties to support him. But after all the trauma that he had put Carolynne through, I don't know if I would say that he deserves it. But let me know what you guys think. It was crazy to research the story, and I cannot believe that someone went through all this trouble to have sex. Like, it's actually insane. He couldn't wait 1 year to be married to this girl, and maybe they would have had a really happy marriage. But I guess we'll never know. Also, just wanted to confirm that the ONA were not responsible for this crime. He had actually written those notes himself and then sent them to the residents for his mother to find. Super unhinged. Julian, if you're out there, I am so interested to know why you did this all. Are you not embarrassed? I am embarrassed for you. Anyway, thank you guys for joining me for another True Crime Tuesday episode. I'm so happy that you're here with me today. Today actually marks a month since I've started making these videos and I absolutely love it. I have so much fun filming them, editing them, as well as doing the research for them. So if you have any stories or things I should cover, please comment them down below or feel free to message me. But I will see you next week with a brand new true crime story. And until then, please stay safe and I'll see you next week. Bye guys.